In this episode, I talked to Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, diplomat, politician, and one of Germany's most accomplished public figures in questions of foreign policy. Alexander is a member of the Bundestag, deputy chairman of the FDP-Fraktion, and designated German ambassador to Russia. He studied at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. on a Fulbright grant in 1993, and was then trained and served as a diplomat for 10 years. Served as a member of the European Parliament for 13 years and has been a member of the Bundestag for 6 years. We talk about how the United States changed during the time he served in the German embassy in Washington, D.C.
I was in the United States at the time of the 9/11 attacks, the anthrax threat, the so-called Washington sniper.
About European integration.
It's a particular way of living together as a union of 27 nations. You won't find another part of the world that has this incredible wealth.
The European and German transatlantic relationship.
China is what we call a systemic rival. We need to defend our way of life in the face of a systemic rival that has a completely different set of values. I would still see that foreign policy by the European Union closely aligned with that of the United States.
And his vision for Europe.
Well, I think the European Union will only become stronger and more coherent if a smaller number of member states form what I would call an avant-garde.
We also talk about his past in the Russia department in the German Federal Foreign Office in the early 2000s.
I had to analyze the documents, the speeches, the measures taken by the Russian Federation at the time.
And the role he can play as a German ambassador in Moscow in times of Russia's war against Ukraine. I'm certain you'll enjoy this episode with Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, interviewed by Mohammed Khan. Before we start with the difficult questions, let's start with some easy quick ones, shall we? So, Kölsch or Pils?
Oh, definitely Kölsch.
I was fearing that. What hurts more, losing an FDP state election or an FC Cologne match?
I have to give it to the state election in that case. I'm an avid supporter of FC Cologne, but on that matter, I tend to be a little bit more serious when it comes to politics. So there, the answer is easy.
Who sends more Porsche selfies in the FDP WhatsApp group, Christian Lindner or Volker Wissing?
Oh, Volker Wissing doesn't drive a Porsche, so that must definitely be Christian Lindner.
Who has more letters in their name, you or Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann, considering full names?
Oh, with full names, it's definitely me, because my full name, as I come from a very old family and there's some nobility involved there as well, my full name is actually rather long. And so it has Marie-Agnes hands down.
I looked it up, it's 66 letters, just in case you were ever wondering.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Brussels or Berlin? You don't get Bonn, sorry.
Well, actually both. I am happy to be here in Berlin and work in the Bundestag, but I've had a great time during my years in the European Parliament. And so that's a question where I won't say either or, but both.
That is actually cheating, but okay.
Yeah, but we'll have to live with it.
What is older, Joe Biden or the average Bundeswehr equipment?
Actually, the American president is older, but you are hinting at something that's quite serious. That's actually something that I'm dealing with on a daily basis here, because I'm also in charge of our team on the Defense Committee, and replacing our material for the armed forces is something that's imperative. Absolutely.
Indeed, we're gonna talk about this in a bit too. Ballauf or Schenk? Kommissar Ballauf or Kommissar Schenk?
That's also a good question. That's really for experts of the Tatort. I think Ballauf. I'd go more with Ballauf, although I like Freddy Schenk, but it's Ballauf speaks more to me.
I'm actually on the Schenk side, but okay, we're gonna continue anyway.
Well, you're on the Pils side. You're always on the wrong side.
Yeah, I see. Lanz or Maischberger?
I think these are talk shows that can't really be compared with one another because they are so very different. I've appeared on both of them several times, and I wouldn't want to compare them because Lanz is a small circle, of people talking to one another over an extended period of time, whereas the Maischberger program is really a montage, it's a staccato of different impressions during her broadcast, with the only continuous element being a choir, if you want to express it in Greek drama terms, a choir of journalists giving comment on what's going on, with the talk show guests. And so it's really not comparable.
Which one did you watch yesterday? Any or none?
No, none. I was busy until late yesterday, and my first appointment this morning was early, so I didn't get around to seeing any of them. But I know that they're very good. They reach a great audience, and I know that on Maischberger you've had the leaders of the two largest parties in Germany, which speaks to the importance that the body politic in Germany ascribes to these talk shows. Congrats to Sandra Maischberger for having them on her program, both at the same time. But it's I didn't get around to watching it.
Okay, final one. What is your guilty pleasure?
Ice cream. I love ice cream. That's the guilty pleasure. And I have to say, though, that I just now, about an hour ago, checked out the new cover of the Atlantic magazine, which is my absolute favorite. And they have an article this month on the health benefits of ice cream. And so I'm really excited to get the new copy of the Atlantic to study how my guilty pleasure is actually not a guilty pleasure, but conducive to my health.
Okay. Speaking of guilty pleasures, you are the deputy chairman of the liberal parliamentary group, the FDP-Fraktion, in Germany. What is your political view and how did it form?
Well, my political views formed in the 1980s when I was a young man. It was a decade of very existential security debates. We've had the Soviet Union put up missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, the SS-20, and NATO responding by the so-called dual-track decision, i.e. Positioning missiles of its own, but at the same time extending the hand for disarmament talks. That was a decision that I found was so crucial and so right that I have been a security policy person ever since. And then in addition, in the 1980s, we've still had a political landscape that was quite different from today, including what the other parties thought. But at the end of the day, a competitive economy, a strong security policy posture, and social tolerance. These were the elements that brought me to the German liberals, because they stand for all of these dimensions.
Mm-hmm. In the early 90s, you went on to study in Washington, D.C. You obtained 2 master's degrees from Georgetown University, one of which from the School of the Foreign Service, or School of Foreign Service. Why did you want to go to the U.S. in the first place?
Well, the United States, if you're a foreign policy person, of course, is the most important actor. It's the at the time the Cold War had just ended. It was a time of great realignment, and so I thought that going to the United States to deepen my understanding of international relations as a young man trying to work in that field later on was the right thing to do. That was sort of the substantive point, if you want. There was a cultural dimension to it too, because I've been one of the people who never believed what you sometimes hear in Germany. Look at the Americans. There's no culture there. I think that's complete bollocks, frankly speaking. It's complete nonsense. I think there is a distinct American culture. And I wanted to experience that firsthand, and it's a very different dimension. So I used the time in Washington to use I used my time there to travel around the United States, up and down the East Coast mostly, to learn more about the country and get a better understanding. And I felt confirmed. I felt that there is a distinct American culture that is distinct also from us here in Europe, Germany, France, Italy, etc., Poland. And it's a culture that I think is worth studying. So these were the two major reasons, really.
Mm-hmm. How came you applied for a Fulbright scholarship?
Excuse me?
How came you applied for a Fulbright grant?
Well, I went to the university in Bonn, and the Fulbright office at the time was in Bonn, actually. And so I had heard people talk about it, and I had researched various options, to finance my university program, because that, of course, is always a challenge for Europeans when they go to the United States. I mean, it's a challenge for American families as well, but in our high tax environment, just to spend $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 on an academic year is not something that comes easily. And so, having looked at the various programs, I thought Fulbright is the one, because it's the primary transatlantic program in my view, and that's why I chose it, and luckily was accepted.
You came back from the US and joined McKinsey for an internship. Why not stay in the business world? Like, it seems you had certain interest for the business world. Why not stay in the business world?
Well, actually, that internship at McKinsey helped me to, check out a little bit the business world and to wonder whether it would be a motivating task for me to get up every morning and dedicate my life and my work and my time and my energy to a business cause. And I found that, compared to what I had done at Georgetown before, working on trade policy, studying trade policy, not working on it, studying trade policy and looking at international relations, motivated me much more. So it was a very useful time. I enjoyed my time at McKinsey, but I found out that for me personally, other things motivate me more.
Okay, interesting. You already said that we both said it, that you stayed to work internationally. You entered foreign service for the following 10 years, for the following decade. How come you ended up in the US again?
Well, I became a diplomat. I applied for the German Foreign Office, was again happily accepted, and then joined the policy planning staff at the time of Klaus Kinkel and then later on Joschka Fischer. And my purview, the one that I was given, consisted of two elements: Southeastern Europe and the United States, transatlantic relations at policy planning. And so I worked on that, and when time came for my first posting abroad, I guess the personnel department looked at my biography and at the things that I had done at policy planning, and concluded that it might not be such a bad idea to send the young Lambsdorff to Washington again, in that case. And I have to say that I had a great time at the German embassy there. I worked with Wolfgang Ischinger, who was my boss, and I enjoyed that greatly.
I think you were in the US in the beginning of the millennium. That means during the historical times of 9/11, of the Afghanistan, of the start of the Afghanistan war. How did the US change during the time you were there?
Fundamentally. I mean, I was in the United States at the time of the 9/11 attacks. I was there for the anthrax threat in D.C. when, someone sent around, letters filled with white powder, and it wasn't clear whether it was anthrax or not. Actually, it's something that's completely forgotten in Germany these days. At the very same time, or around that time, we also have the so-called Washington sniper, someone who's driving around and shooting random bypassers, people who were peacefully going about their business, and nobody knew whether this was a political or a criminal activity. I mean, it would have been criminal even if it had been political. Turned out it was just a psychotic criminal. But the threat perception in Washington, D.C., I think, was completely changed forever. I believe that this notion of isolation from the rest of the world, from being immune to threats, from not being vulnerable at all on its own territory, that all changed, and it changed in the national capital, as it did, of course, in New York City and in other parts of the country. And that change led to certain overreactions, obviously the US Patriot Act, for example, that are understandable in a historical context. Politically speaking, we didn't agree with much of what was in the act, but historically, of course, one can explain why that happened. And the debate about civil liberties was much tougher at that time. So a number of things that happened there. And on a personal note, on a very personal note, I had small children at the time, and my family, we had boxes filled with cans and batteries and drinking waters, and we knew exactly where we had to go in case of another attack, because nobody knew whether this attack was going to be repeated or not. That was completely unclear. We didn't know. And evacuation plans were commonplace at the time. So as you can tell from what I'm telling you now, and it's rather lengthy, it impressed me. It left a very strong impression on me, how the United States changed in the early 2000s compared to the early 1990s when I was there for the first time.
Mm-hmm. I assume you had no power over saying you wanted to stay in Washington or not. I assume that was something that was followed up by the Foreign Service.
The Foreign Service works on the basis of rotation, and so I was rotated back from DC to our national capital, which by then had moved from Bonn to Berlin, and so I took up my job here at the Foreign Office in Berlin.
You worked in the Russia department.
Yes.
What did you work on back then? And was this already related to Putin policy?
It was. I was the desk officer for Russian foreign policy at the German Foreign Office, 2003, 2004. And of course, President Putin was in office. The Chechen war had ended. And the analysis of Russia's policy was my task. So I had to analyze the documents, the speeches, the measures taken by the Russian Federation at the time in terms of its foreign policy. And so definitely, yes, that had to do with the president at the time, which was, and as we all know, still is, Vladimir Putin.
Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about Putin in a bit more. For the moment, let's talk about Europe. So you switched over from foreign service into European politics, right? You were elected member of the European Parliament, served for 13 years, in the end even as one of the Parliament's vice presidents. Was European integration stronger when you joined the Parliament or when you left it? Apart from monetary policy, because sure, monetary policy was certainly increased, but let's take the monetary policy out of the equation. Let's talk about agreement in the European integration apart from monetary policy.
Well, I think that, first of all, it's of course difficult to simply look at it without the monetary dimension because, as they say, follow the money. If a union like the European Union, creates a common currency, for example, or weathers a strong and quite impressive crisis like the world financial crisis of 2008, 9, 10, together, creating new institutions that deepen the monetary integration, that goes a long way. That's a lot. But leaving that aside, as you suggest, I believe it's become more difficult to find agreement on a number of topics. Not so much in the single market. The single market, it's important not to think about it as a static marketplace, but the single market is a set of evolving rules and regulations. That's what the single market is. In that field, you have majority voting, both in the Council and in the Parliament, and so therefore you do find agreement there more easily than in areas of unanimity, like foreign policy, like taxation, or other fields, where enlargement, for example, where you need unanimity. In the areas where you have unanimity, it's become more difficult, I find, to reach agreement, and that has to do, of course, with the rise of nationalism in some member states. If you look at Hungary, if you look at Poland, you have two important member states with a proud national history who have joined the European Union and have unfortunately decided to refocus on the national dimension of their political life rather than on their contribution to the European project. And while the two countries are certainly not the only ones, to blame when you talk about integration, I think particularly the issues of the rule of law, something that should bind us together, are issues that these countries, view in a very different way from the rest of the European Union, and that makes things difficult.
I mean, the UK left, I think they voted to leave the EU while you've been in the EP. So how has that impacted foreign policy?
Now, on foreign policy, it has improved things because no country has been more stubborn and blocking anything and everything that had to do with common foreign policy positions, and particularly security policy, than the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has had a very privileged position inside the European Union. It had a number of opt-outs, things that it simply didn't want to accept for itself, the social charter, the euro, the Schengen area, etc., etc. And it had the very strong conviction that no security policy should ever be pursued at the European level, at the EU level, I should be correct here. The moment they left, all of a sudden, it was possible to move ahead on research on security-related products, for example, something the EU can fund now. It was possible to create a European peace facility, something we use now to finance the support for Ukraine. It is possible to make advances in a common foreign and security policy. So on the foreign policy dimension, for the UK to have left the European Union has been a boon to European integration and not a problem. On other issues, like our economic weight, our role in global trade, of course the United Kingdom is a loss for the EU, because it's an important economy. It's a member of the G7, and therefore, when you look at Europe from, say, Beijing or DC or Brasilia, not having the UK inside the EU is something that is perceived as weakening the European Union.
After you left the European Parliament, you wrote a book, When the Elephants Fight. In the book, you refer to the European way of life. What is that?
Oh, the European way of life is, people who live here, I think, would realize it. We have the rule of law. We have free elections. We have a market economy that is tempered by social policies that are very, very highly developed, more highly developed than in any other part of the world. We value culture and fund it publicly. And then, in other parts of the world, culture is something that's done privately. But here, the state supports cultural endeavors. Particularly in Germany, if you look at all the orchestras and theaters that we have, for example. And it is within the European Union, we have a space where people can travel freely, where they can settle freely, where they can work wherever they like, where they can study wherever they like. And it's a particular way of living together as a union of 27 nations that is absolutely unique, both in terms of our history as a continent and in terms of geography. If you look around the world, you won't find another part of the world that has this incredible I would say, Reichtum, this incredible wealth of factors that define the European way of life.
Unfortunately, you're not the only one drawing inspiration from the US. Xi proclaimed the Chinese dream, so where you're talking about the European way of life, certainly borrowed from the American way of life. Xi speaks of the Chinese dream. Unfortunately, a very different concept, though, than the American dream, one might add. So it describes China's rise to the world world superpower, maybe to the world single superpower, the new Silk Road, fully subsidized industry, alliance with Russia, massive investments in Europe, even in Germany, trade unions. How do we deal with China in the long term from a European perspective?
Well, I think we have found at the EU level a very good definition of how best to view China. China can be a partner. China can be a competitor. And China is what we call a systemic rival. Now, what does that mean? China can be a partner on issues like fighting terrorism, climate change, non-proliferation, international challenges. China, if China so chooses, they can be a partner. China is a competitor. I mean, they have products that compete for customers in the same markets as European or American products or services do. But, and that's the crucial difference here, China is a systemic rival. What does that mean? You just mentioned the American dream. The American dream focuses on the individual person living in America, trying to live freely and in a dignified way, creating a level of wealth and independence for him or herself, as well as the family. The Chinese dream focuses entirely on the state, on achieving power for the state. It's a completely different vision. And when you look at the organization of the state, a digital communist dictatorship, you recognize that our societies, the way we view our countries, our nations, the issue of individual dignity are so fundamentally different that we need to realize that an expansion of Chinese power comes at the detriment of things that we cherish very much. And that goes for Americans and Europeans. And when I wrote the book, I said it's important to defend our European way of life, because I believe the Americans have understood that the American way of life is special. It's distinct from the European way of life, but they are clearly determined to defend the American way of life. I believe we need, as Europeans, we need to come to the same conclusion, that we need to defend our way of life in the face of a systemic rival that has a completely different set of values.
Mm-hmm. So what you were just doing is saying, basically, I know that this is not exactly what you said, but let me simplify things. You say China is a bit of the bad guy because of the systemic differences. America is is the good guy here, or the United States. And Macron stated we shouldn't side with the United States without a second look. We should be more self-confident. Maybe it sounded like he was taking side with China much more, right? So how do you assess this?
Well, it was an unfortunate interview, and President Macron weakened European unity on China, something we had developed over a couple of years. However, he didn't go quite as far as you just posited it, because he did not say that we should part ways with the United States. But what he emphasizes, and has emphasized in the past as well, is what he calls European sovereignty, and that is fine. I mean, we can discuss it, and we can, develop a common foreign and security policy that's truly deserving of that name. I would still, and I know that this is the majority view in Germany, I would still see that foreign policy by the European Union closely aligned with that of the United States. And the French perspective, President Macron's perspective is slightly different. He wants to have completely independent decision-making on both sides of the Atlantic. I believe a synchronized way of decision-making is best when we have divergent interests, and that of course happens between the United States and the European Union. It's fine if we go our way and the Americans go a slightly different way. Look at the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, now, which has clearly protectionist elements that hurt European interests massively, as, by the way, they hurt Japanese and Korean interests, the main allies in the Pacific. So then these are things that we need to discuss, that we need to talk about, and where Europe needs to be strong enough to fend for itself. But I believe in the face of a global geopolitical competition, no two areas are, in terms of our values, more closely aligned than the United States and Europe. And I think that's something we should cherish and promote rather than belittle. And it was a little bit of a belittling of that proximity in that interview by President Macron. And I really didn't agree with it at all.
Mm-hmm. Just recently, China has performed military drills in the Taiwan Strait in response to diplomacy between US and Taiwan. The foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, demanded from China to, of course, stop with any military exercises. At the same time, she kind of insinuated, of course, that we're always going with the United States. At the same time, we're asking China to take a stance against Russia. So can we ask both? Is this possible? Or do we have to decide what we want from China? It's like currently it seems that we're definitely diverging, global West, somehow diversifying, weakening our bonds with China. That is currently what is happening. Is China still, so you say they're a systemic rival. How do we still get them to cooperate, for example, in the matter of the Russian war against Ukraine?
Well, I believe that's not necessarily a contradiction. I mean, you can analyze the Chinese political system and come to the conclusions that I've just described. On the other hand, China is a country that sees itself as a very close friend of many developing nations. And for many developing nations, national sovereignty, the inviolability of their respective national borders, that's something that's very important to them. And so for China, to side very closely with Russia, a country that has just invaded its neighbor, its smaller neighbor, not respecting national sovereignty, not respecting borders, not respecting international law that is there to serve as a protection against activities like that. For China to side with Russia on this issue must raise questions with many of China's friends and clients around the world. So I believe it is not a contradiction to look at the Chinese political system, analyze it, come to the conclusions that I've described. We do have completely different sets of values in terms of our political setup. And at the same time, pointing out that geopolitically, China would be well advised to keep a certain distance from Russia for the very reason that I just said, because many countries will get nervous if a country like China no longer respects the fundamental principles of the inviolability of borders and national sovereignty.
Mm-hmm. And sovereignty doesn't really apply to Taiwan. I think the one China policy is basically a result of our decision to accept China's internal policies the way they are without interfering with the internal policy. Is that something that we should continue?
Well, I think the one China policy is not up for debate. I mean, around the world, what you see, including in the United States, there's a legal acknowledgement of the fact that Beijing represents China, and that the island of Taiwan legally is part of that China. Now, over time, two completely different political systems have evolved. And in Taiwan, you have a vibrant democracy, and you have a very independent development, an independent mindset, an independent economic policy making on Taiwan. So I believe the legal situation being what it is, and the empirical, the real status quo, the de facto status quo, are what they are, and they're not up for discussion. That's why we said in our coalition agreement here in Germany that should Beijing consider unification something desirable, it would have to happen peacefully and involve the consensus of both sides, an agreement of both sides. I mean, as Germans, we know what it means to live in one nation with two political systems on it. I mean, we've had this for 40 years. Germany was always considered one nation, but we had two political systems here. And then when unification came around, it was by consensus and peacefully. That's what we would consider a model, for other situations. Think of the Koreas or China and Taiwan.
A couple of minutes ago, you said that it is sometimes difficult to reach consensus. Macron is the most recent example. What is your vision for Europe of the 21st century? And how do we want to position ourselves? How do we achieve on this? How do we achieve on this vision that you will be outlining?
Well, I think the European Union will only become stronger and more coherent if a smaller number of member states form what I would call an avant-garde, a group of countries that is, pioneering a deeper integration, and that, for example, creates a military integration that we don't have at this moment in time. That would bind our fates together inextricably. That's something that I think might be an idea. I don't envisage this to be happening with all 27 at the same time, because think of Austria, for example, with its policy of neutrality. That you will always have one or two exceptions. So it has to be a smaller group of countries led by France and Germany, in a way, however, that invites other countries, if they so wish, to join. I mean, it should not be exclusive and sort of, keeping everybody out, but setting an example. You can also talk about joint border protection. I mean, we have Frontex, a border protection agency that has hardly any powers. I mean, it really cannot do anything independently of national decision-making processes. That's something where I believe our citizens demand more.
Frontex is, of course, quite contrary to the way that we as Europeans define our way of European living, because it has been up to discussion whether Frontex is actually complying to even universal human rights, right? With these illegal pushbacks happening all over the eastern border.
Well, I mean, there has been a very lively political debate. The head of Frontex has resigned, but there's absolutely no doubt that our citizens demand an effective protection of the external borders of the European Union, and that's absolutely clear. And if you look, I'm talking about the sort of the legal setup of Frontex. Frontex is an intergovernmental agency, and when Frontex agents go to a particular country, the country will determine what Frontex can do and what Frontex cannot do. I believe it should be the other way around. It should be a joint European effort based on a joint European border protection law, and that Frontex then could really make a contribution. That's in terms of a vision for the future. I believe it's something citizens want, where we have a European tool, and we sorely underuse that European tool because of a lack of courage on the part of particularly the ministries of the interior, so departments of Homeland Security, you would say in the United States, to actually pool sovereignty on that particular issue and work together. That is something that I believe we need to do. We need to look at what citizens demand and then answer to the demands of citizens. And that's one example where it comes, where I believe that we can do more. Let me say one more thing, however. We are now 27 member states. We have the Western Balkans knocking on our door. We have given a membership perspective to Ukraine and Moldova. So the European Union may become even larger. I believe we will also need some form of status where you're very close to the European Union without being inside the European Union. If you want, an association that goes farther than what we have now, but that doesn't involve full membership at the outset, because the decision-making processes inside the Union have become so difficult that, as I said earlier, reaching consensus has also concurrently become more difficult.
If all goes according to plan, you will become German ambassador in Moscow, as long as you can still freely talk, because you won't be able to do this, right? You're going to be bound by the decisions that the foreign ministry dictates to you. As long as you can still freely talk, let's try to make use of this. What is your assessment of the war situation in Ukraine and the political situation in Russia?
Well, I should say that inside the Foreign Office we can all talk freely to one another, and there's no diktat or I'm not being dictated things, but I'm joining the Foreign Service, rejoining the Foreign Service to make a contribution there. But what is of course correct is that I will have a boss that I don't have as a parliamentarian, and the boss is the foreign minister. So in that sense, it's a different kind of work. As far as the situation goes, if you look at the original war aims of the Russian Federation and compare them to the current situation, I think it's rather obvious that the only conclusion one can draw today is that the campaign so far has been a failure, militarily speaking. Politically speaking, it has created an enormous amount of damage. The relations between the West and Russia are extremely difficult as we speak. Economically speaking, if you look at the Russian public finances, it has also created serious problems for the Russian Federation. If you look at their, for example, level of indebtedness and the state budget at the beginning of this year, you note that they've gone way beyond what was originally planned. So I believe that, measured by whichever yardstick you want to use, the campaign has been a failure, and it would be good if Russia ceded this invasion, this war of aggression that it's started against Ukraine. I believe that's fairly obvious for everyone to see.
What can we do more? Is it just so you suggest we have to wait until until for some reason one of the parties decides to do what? Because Ukraine can't decide to do anything else but what they're doing right now. So do we just wait for Putin to move, or what is our strategy?
Well, I mean, we've seen an invasion by Russia, a war of aggression. And the Ukraine is based on Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, is exercising its right to self-defense. This is a military campaign, and this military campaign will. It's terrible one has to talk about this way in Europe, where we thought we had really moved beyond this. But this military campaign will run its course, and we do not know when we reach that point. But at that point, diplomacy and politics will regain primacy, and the military outcome will co-determine, the nature of the talks that ensue. That's where we stand, and what we do in the West, that's not secret. We support Ukraine in the exercise of its right to self-defense through military support, arms deliveries, financial support, and political support. And so I think that's where we stand right now, and I don't see that policy changing anytime soon. On the contrary, when President Biden says we will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, that's echoed by European leaders. And other leaders around the world. So we'll see when and how Russia will hopefully reconsider its approach.
Okay, so you already said that diplomacy is harsh. Probably it's the worst point in time, I would imagine, to become a diplomat, because your job is diplomacy, and if diplomacy has basically come to a halt, what can your impact as an ambassador be at the time that you take over the office?
Well, I believe as a professional diplomat, it's always important to keep talking to one another, even if and when one disagrees strongly. Of course, we disagree strongly with what the Russian Federation has undertaken as its current political priority. We believe it's a mistake. But diplomacy has not come to a halt. It would be wrong to say that. But we talk to the Russian Federation as we talk to other countries with whom we have disagreements. And I consider this to be my task, to listen to what the Russian side says, to convey to them the positions of the German government, and to discern a change in position, a nuance, a possible evolution of policies of the Federation, if and when they occur. If they don't occur, it will be my duty to report and analyze, to report on that and analyze together with the team at the embassy, where we believe Russian policy is headed. I think it's a very important job. I'm looking forward to doing it. It's a challenge, certainly, but I believe that it's important that someone does it.
Thank you so much. We wish you best of luck in your new role. Thank you so much, Alexander.
No, thank you so much for all the questions.